Hi, Joseph. Good to have you with us on the Grail.
Good to be here finally.
Can you maybe just introduce yourself for people? People my age know who you are pretty much because I came through the internet very early on, and Ong's Hat was everywhere at that
Yeah,
stage
yeah,
for
yeah.
me anyway. Um, but for anybody a bit younger than me, maybe you can just introduce yourself and a bit about Ong's Hat.
Um, yeah, so I'm an artist and I do a lot of work that has to do with interdisciplinary work, which basically is I use all different kinds of mediums and I tell stories across mediums, which has been called several things over the years. Like I called it living book when I first started doing it, and then it got picked up and was called ARG, alternate reality gaming, and then it got more formalized and was called transmedia. And then I just kind of went back to calling it interdisciplinary because that's what I first knew it as way back in the day. And it's kind of like come around to where it's more accepted and we don't have to have all these fancy buzzwords anyway. So I'm just, I'm an interdisciplinary artist. That's what I do.
Yeah. And Ong's Hat, can you give a quick overview just for everyone as to just the overall topic? I know it's
Yeah.
pretty complex once
Yeah.
you
Well,
dig into it, but
it's a 30-year project now these days. And it started as a mail art project back in the 80s. And then I migrated it to the bulletin board systems in the late 80s and early 90s. And then I migrated it from there onto the general internet when that became kind of publicly accessible to most people. And it's a lot of things, but it's basically it's a story about a parallel world and a parallel universe and in many dimensions. So it's a folk tale that started out like really vague, and then it got like picked up by some people, me included, and then I've just kind of been forming it and forming it and forming it over the years, and it's kind of become a folk tale now. If you go to that area and you talk to people, some people will tell you they've heard of this story before, and they'll even tell you like, when I was a kid, I remember those people were living in the woods, So it's definitely taken a life of its own, which is
yeah,
cool. I mean, that was always the intention of the project.
yeah, there's a. I mean, we'll dig into these, but there's all those legend tripping and ostension sort
Exactly,
of
exactly.
things
Yeah,
to dig into there, where it started as a book that kind of pretended to not pretend to be, but people didn't know whether it was fiction or reality,
it was
and then it
both.
grew. It
Yeah,
was a
yeah,
bit of both,
yeah,
but then sort of for people, it kind of took on its own life.
yeah.
And I need to
Even
kind of
for me, it took
explain.
on life. That I was like, what?
I'll bet. For people who are younger, I need to explain that when I was on the early web, it was everywhere. On like, if you're on a computer forum, people were talking about it. If
Yeah,
you're on a magic forum, if you're on an alt history forum or page, or because we didn't have
yeah.
social media back then, like it was just covering so many different parts of life. People were interested in it and mentioning it, um, and it's kind of funny to me that in a way it's kind of receded into the background. It probably hasn't for you, but if I talk to people about it now, they don't sort of talk about it as much. But it was just everywhere then.
It still is, but it's in a different way. So it's like you said, it's backgrounded now, but it's backgrounded in the way that technology, like the internet, used to be a thing that we made magazines about back in the early '90s, and now the internet's just a thing that everybody knows about. That's everywhere. So I
Yeah,
think Ongtat kind of has followed that trend. Is like I see because I have bots that are gathering intelligence on it all the time and sending me back reports, and so I see people mentioning it in all kinds of ways that may not even know the story, but it's become almost like a meme. Um, where well, a lot of times, like when people are trying to be funny, when if they fill out a profile on like Reddit or someplace like that, they'll put that where they live is Ong's Hat. It, it's like it's kind of like a jeer, like yeah, I live in Ong's Hat. Yeah, that's where I live. Um, and so that's kind of cool. And there's on YouTube all the time. I'm finding videos of kids that are going. I call them kids because I'm 62 in a couple of weeks. That are like going out on motorcycles and trying to find the ashram in Ong's Hat, and they're videotaping themselves, and they put their stuff up on YouTube, and so it's kind of cool, and there's people talking about it all the time, like talking about the legend, and they either come from the perspective of like trying to, portray it as being like, no, this really happened, and whatever, however they want to do that, I'm fine with that. And there's other people that want to, dissect the legend and the project and the process and some of the stuff that happened. And so it's got all kind of different things, but it's like there's I think there's less of a centralized community spaces like we had in the early 90s. Like, like everybody that was on the early internet was probably into Terence McKenna. They were probably into magic. They were probably into drugs on some level. Yeah. Like they probably went to Deoxy, hung out at Deoxy. Like that seemed to be the first stop for everybody. And of course, Dimitri had put all the Ong's Hat material on Deoxy back then, so it was like one of the good places to go find it. But I think there was more of a centralized community back then, and now it's kind of like here came everybody, and it's like very different now.
There goes the neighborhood.
But it's more like going to a mall and seeing all the different people from all the different walks of life, whereas. Yeah. The early days of the internet, it was more specialized. Like if you were on the internet, like in the early 90s, you were definitely one of several types of people. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you were definitely probably a counterculture person, or you're an academic, or you were a government employee. That was about it. That's who was there.
Yeah. It is interesting though, in terms of, in the last 10 years or so, we've seen things like Slender Man and, these new mythoses emerging. I'm kind of interested. Does anybody actually come to you talking about those things, being such a pioneer in the field?
All the time. In the early days of ARGs, when I'm going to say 2001-ish, I was working with Electronic Arts on the Majestic program, and I was part of that beta crew. And then after that, I met some people, and then anytime somebody wanted to do something like an ARG and attach it to a movie, I was living in Hollywood at the time. They would call me up and use me as a consultant, and so I've been contacted by a lot of people. Academics over the years have contacted me about the phenomena. Yeah. Like they wanted to know about ARGs and Slender Man and legend tripping, and because we were doing legend tripping back then, but we didn't have that name for it. But then it became the academics always have to have names for something, so they named it legend tripping. And I think that was Michael Kinsella.
Yeah,
one of the people that came up with that name.
He wrote a book on Ong's Hat.
He wrote a book on
sort of based
Ong's
around Ong's Hat
and legend tripping. Yeah. It was basically about legend tripping, and he used Ong's Hat as an example.
Do you want to just quickly explain what legend tripping is for people that don't know?
Yeah, so we've all done it probably. The example I always give is that there's the legend of there's a road in the country where you can go with the car, and you put the car in neutral, and you've dusted the bumper with talcum powder, and then you'll notice the car will roll. And then you stop and get out and look, and there's little handprints in the talcum powder, and it's like the legend is like there was some kids that got run over or got lost, or it's always different, but it's basically the ghosts of some kids are pushing your car away from the danger zone, and you can see the evidence with the handprints, and like people go do that. That's the legend trip. You go do that and see if it happens.
Yeah,
and I mean we've all done it. Or you go to this one place and there's a ghost that will show up, or an orb that will show up, or the beast that will show up in the woods, and you go to do it. And it's largely young people that do this as a really I think as an excuse to get away from parental oversight and get into the woods together and do kid things. But like the legend trip always has to be. It's kind of like Bloody Mary. Do you remember that Bloody Mary? If you go in the bathroom and stare in the mirror and say her name 3 times, Bloody Mary will appear. That's a legend trip in a way.
Yeah. I guess it's also just the mundanity of modern life and materialism overwhelming everything. It's like a modern way for people to connect with something sacred or mystical or something like that, I guess.
Yeah, reaching back into the mythological aspect of life is something that I see people doing more and more every day. I do vigils where I take people out for like 5 days in the woods or in the desert. I used to when I lived down south, but now I live up in the woods now, and take people out and really help them to understand that there's a conversation that can be had with the land. And if you grew up, in the city, and you're surrounded by modernity all the time, and you're always staring at your phone, and you're surrounded by cars and pavement and lights, and you can't find true darkness at night because you live in a city. That's something that is really relevant and it needs to happen to young people. So I lead them on these vigils where we talk about that, like, put your phones away. You're not going to have your phone for 5 days, and that's going to hurt. You don't realize how much it's going to hurt, but you're going to find out. And then you're going to have to ask yourself, am I addicted to this?
Yeah, for sure. And there's, I've talked in a few different forums about just those spirits of place. You just get to a place, and if you get rid of all the noise, you feel like you're making connection to something else there.
Yeah. I do this once a month. I do a video podcast with Dave Metcalf and Ken Eakins from Sitting Now. We call it the Mauve Zone because we're all fans of Kenneth Grant. And the thing we were talking about the other day was interesting. It's how much people don't just sit and be quiet and look and listen. And we were talking about our animals. Like I have a lot of animals. And so I really have conversations with them that are nonverbal. I've spent enough time where I just don't talk and I just watch them, and I learn how much they're telling me by their motions and their expressions and all the things that they do that are nonverbal. It's a conversation. Like if you really just kind of check out and unplug, put your phone away for a day, and then it's like sit with your horse. You'll find that your horse has a lot to tell you. And they actually really appreciate that you're like, oh, he's here, he's present, he's with me.
Yeah. Same for children. like a lot of people, and probably might lead into one of the other topics I want to talk about, but social media has just like ramped that up through the roof in terms of everyone's just constantly checking feeds on different things. Like with information overload, how difficult is it for those sort of archetypal, mythological things to come through when it's just all this trivial information constantly hitting us?
It's really hard. I spent many years in Silicon Valley. From the early days, I was like an early Silicon Valley person. And so I was living the always on life before social media and then after social media, of course. And it's like in 2008, when the whole economy slid off the cliff, and I got involved in Occupy Los Angeles and Occupy San Francisco. And I dropped out of corporate life and just said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to pay attention to this. I'm going to like unplug. I actually went and deleted all my social media accounts, and people actually, corporate people that I've known for a long time that don't know my other side, they do now. They became concerned, and they actually staged an intervention because they thought there was something wrong with me. They're like, oh my God, he's like going to commit suicide or something, because I was like unplugging and checking out. And I'm like, no, just the opposite. I'm getting back in touch with life. It's like, and I have to like be drastic about this, and I have to cut all this stuff out of my life for a long time. I'm going to be gone for a while. And I was gone until I didn't come back to social media until 2019. So it was 9 years I was gone. And oddly enough, the other day I was listening to a podcast and my name came up, and one of the hosts said, is he still alive? I thought he was dead. A lot of people assumed that I had, really checked out. But what I had done is checked out altogether from technology. And so I had a very drastic turnaround in my thinking. And so I grew up, fan of Robert Anton Wilson, eventually a friend of his, listening to Alt Leary in the early days and Terence McKenna and all this cyber shamanism thing that we thought we were doing in the early 90s. You probably were there too. Like we all thought we were doing this thing. And then it kind of hit me in 2008 that we really weren't doing that thing, that we were following a trail of very bad ideas,
Yeah.
and I wanted to get off, and I wanted to unplug, detox from this, and then rethink it. And so that's what I did.
I'd recommend it too. With the whole Elon Musk Twitter thing, I kind of hopped off Twitter. I'm still on social media, but a whole lot less. And I think it's pretty good for the brain. I'd recommend it to people to do it.
It's very good. I'm basically there now to promote the trilogy that I just finished. And I've got one more book that I'm writing about the history of Ong's Hat. And after I publish that, I probably will just, again, check out and, let those accounts just decay over time.
Speaking about social media, one of the topics I wanted to talk about is how these alternate reality games that you've pioneered have now really, I think, been weaponized, and how easily they can be spread through social media, what that means for us, and particularly, obviously, I think we've both sort of campaign not being the right word, but QAnon, we were both very early pointing out the dangers of both Pizzagate and then QAnon before a lot of people paid attention. Just like to get your thoughts on how social media enables that weaponization, and how, as a pioneer of someone who wanted to use ARGs to inspire, now they're being used for almost completely the opposite.
Yeah. Well, it put me off of ARGs, that and a couple other things, like the commercialization really put me off of it. And after a while, I was like, I didn't help create this format so that it could become a marketing gimmick, and that's kind of what it became, which was in a way discouraging, but that's run its course. And so I was kind of encouraged to say, take all the lessons of what you can do with this and apply it to literature. Maybe don't do ARGs per se anymore, because there's a lot of things that we discovered along the way that, were, I don't want to say wrong, but just like, not what I want to be doing with my art. But the early days, I was just experimenting. Like nobody had ever done anything like this before, and I was just winging it. And so after a while, it became formalized, and then it became ARGs, and then it became commercialized, and then it became formalized as transmedia. And then I think it just kind of has faded away a little bit, which is good, because now we can return to what it was originally, which is a way to tell stories using these new mediums that we have, and a way to intelligently tell stories and use these mediums in an intelligent way. And I don't think it's going to be as universal as we originally thought it might be. It's going to be more localized. So it's going to be, instead of trying to run these giant games like the Microsoft Bungie games and even the EA game that I was involved in, I think we were trying to scale it too large, because we all came from the software world and that's what you do. But if you come from the storytelling world, which I've kind of readjusted to be into that, that tends to work on a smaller scale. It has to be more personalized and localized, right? And so telling a story to more than 100 people, it gets dicey at that point, because we're not constructed to have contact with more than 100 people, really, like not real contact, So small tribes of people is what we are, is what we've been. So this whole thing about broadcasting to the world, it just doesn't work, because then you get what's happened to storytelling. So like the whole Marvelization of storytelling, the Disneyfication of storytelling, it's trying to tell stories that have appealing aspects to a segment of people that were probably identified through a focus group, and that's not storytelling, that's marketing. And I want nothing to do with that. So I'm trying to reorient and think about how do we use these mediums to tell stories that are personalized to a couple hundred of people. Let's not try to scale it up to millions. Let's keep it at a couple hundred to a couple thousand, and just what can we do with that? So that's really what I'm thinking of. So the weaponization part of it kind of goes away when you start thinking of that way. But again, the weaponization thing is unfortunately, it's always going to happen, because everything can be and eventually will be weaponized. So it's not the fault of the format or of the artist. It's the intention of the people that are doing the weaponization.
Yeah,
And so,
I've sort of just with the Daily Grail is it's always been somewhere where I've always liked information that's right at the edges of knowledge, and
yeah,
you know you need to treat it with a bit of skepticism. But it's
yeah,
really interesting. It may be a new scientific discovery. It may be new ways of looking at the world. So that's something I've always tried to promote on the Daily Grail. But in recent years, similarly, all these topics have been weaponized by
yeah,
bad actors in many
yeah, oh, yeah,
ways,
yeah, yeah,
to the point where some days I've just, I wonder, should I be posting this? Am I encouraging people to go down this rabbit hole? Or, it's difficult. How do you, now in the social media era where you can have so many bad actors, and I've been
yeah.
pretty disappointed to find out how many bad actors and just people willing to sell their souls there are.
Right.
I just don't know how we get back to what the strategy is for getting back to looking for the important things and finding truths and being a bit more skeptical. I sometimes think everyone needs like a mass education in Robert Anton Wilson or something like that, not to take things too seriously.
Wouldn't hurt. That wouldn't hurt. Well, a couple of things. The one thing I was saying, which is keeping it local and not trying to universalize it. I think that means you maintain more control over the story. So you don't try to let your story get out of your control, because a story is something very personal, and it's one of the most important aspects of human existence, I think, is storytelling, because this is how we transmit history. This is how we, like I was joking around the other day, but it's really kind of not a joke, which is storytelling is the manual for life. And if you want to RTFM, as we used to say in the tech world, you go to the story. You go back to the tribal story or to the family story or the village story or whatever, however you want to, define it. But you go back to the story. Like, I need to go read the manual. And the manual is there for a reason. The manual is like, there are people that came before you that went through some similar things. And you can refer to that manual, the story, and then you can find out like how they handled it, which might help you handle it. And if you find out that the circumstances have changed and you need to add to the story, then you add to the story. Like, okay, these 5 things is what the elders told us used to happen, but now this 6th thing happens because the environment has changed, or because there's now wolves in the land where there didn't used to be wolves, or there's no wolves where there used to be wolves, and now we have an abundance of deer that are eating all the crops. Like, there's all these things that change, and so then you add to the story. So the story is alive; it lives in the people, and that's one of the things that we've handed over. One of the most sacred aspects of humanity, which is storytelling, the bean counters. Like, like these people at Disney, like, they're not here to tell stories to help us. They're not here to tell stories to embolden us and to enrich us. They're here to tell stories so they can fleece our pockets. And that's all they're here for. So those are not stories I want to know or I want to hear. And they're not stories I'm going to help pass on, right? But I want to get back to, like, what are the stories that we do need to tell? And let's focus on those, because those have kind of gotten washed away in all this, the overtaking of the storytelling mechanism. Like, big media has become the mechanism where people go to see supposedly the legends, and Spider-Man and Iron Man are not my legends. I'm sorry, they're not, but I need to find out what's my legend, and what are our legends, and who are my people. Like Terrence used to say, find the others. Let's go find the others, and let's re-find our stories, and let's recraft the new stories, because that's what we're not doing.
Yeah, I think that's definitely my feeling, just as a person who's always online for a long time now, is the feeling now of more getting back to nature, connecting with small pockets of friends. I think everyone needs to move that direction a bit. I guess what's popped into my head there is, again, the QAnon thing is, for QAnoners, they have found their pocket of people. Well,
they did. They did. Yeah. But it was also, well, okay, my take on QAnon, first of all, none of the things I heard through QAnon, none of it was new. It was all old conspiracy stuff that I had heard before, right? And some of it goes all way, way, way back. Like, like you can even track it back to, like, some of the things that were influencing the Nazis.
Yeah.
I said the N-word, but there it is.
Yeah, you've
So
got adrenochrome, which comes from way back as well.
yeah, exactly. So none of this stuff is new. Um, if you were hanging around in the early days of the internet, um, there were pockets of conspiracy web boards you could go to that all the stuff you would read on those would at that time those were the really far out fringe. Um, but even David Icke was far out fringe at one point, and then he became more mainstream. And then Alex Jones used to be this guy that stood on a street corner in Austin with a megaphone, and then he became mainstream. You know what I mean? So I think what happened is as more people got online and more people got exposed to this stuff, more people started to take it in, and a lot of people that were taking it in, I think, were not sophisticated internet users, and so they really they hadn't built up that callus yet of like, how do I differentiate what's probably BS from what's not? I've always had a good detector on that, but my I guess you could say my problem was that I would indulge this stuff knowing it was garbage, but I would indulge it anyway because it was entertaining. And somewhere along the way, I assumed that that's how most people thought about it. And then in like early 2014, I was in San Francisco doing a gig, just doing a contract gig, and I was subleasing a condo, and I started hanging around some people, and people that I had known for a long time that I would actually have categorized as leftist started to talk about this thing that they were into called neo-reactionary movement. And I'm like, the what? And I started looking into it, and it was like all this, it was like, what was that guy? Moldbug, Menacious Moldbug.
I don't know that.
I think Yarvin is his real name. So he was writing all this stuff. Basically, there was like, we need to move back to like doing away with democracy. We need to run the country like a corporation. There needs to be a CEO, i.e., a monarch. We need to get back into like something like Catholicism. Like it was all this weird movement towards the right, and people that I really knew that were very far left had started to like jump onto this train in 2014, and then that train went along, and I was very puzzled by that, and then the alt-right rose out of that. And a lot of the same people that were into the neo-reactionary movement became alt-right. And I was even more puzzled because now there were people that used to be leftists that were like not only now being soft monarchists, but now they were being like hard right people that eventually voted for Trump. And I'm looking at all this and I'm just like, what is going on? And then I started to like, right before the pandemic started, people started calling me up, and people that I knew that were like occultists and leftists in the past that I knew, they were now like giving me these spiels that I eventually, identified as like coming out of what would be QAnon, but it started with 5G and coronavirus. And like the first time I heard this from a couple of people that I've known for a long time, they were like, always left people in the past. I was like listening to this. I'm like, do you hear yourself? What are you saying? And it's like something had grabbed their mind. And then I realized that these people were spending a lot of time on the internet. And I'm like, oh, I see what's happening here. Like they're getting immersed in this. And so I started to look into it a little bit. And a lot of this was coming in from web ads, online ads. They were being run, they were being targeted because now you can target ads. So they'd be targeted to people that were into like yoga and wellness and all these like subcultures that I had considered myself a part of. And I looked at these ads and they were targeting people into these belief systems, like a little bit and a little bit and a little bit. And I don't think it was a unified movement that was like, there was like one person up there like, oh, we're running these ads and we're going to get them. But it was just like a general organic movement in that direction. What brought it on other than fear, I want to say, maybe, because so many people were so unsure about what was happening in the beginning of the pandemic. Because we forget when the pandemic first showed up, like the first time I heard of something was in December 2019. I was watching a scientist from China who was posting on Imager. He was posting videos, and he was saying there's some kind of respiratory disease going around here, and people are dropping dead left and right. And he was in Wuhan. He eventually died of COVID, but he was one of the first people to whistleblow, and then we heard that, and then we like right after that we started to see it showing up here, and all we heard at that time was there's a thing we don't know what it is. You're probably going to die if you get it. The hospitals are overflowing. People are choking to death and dying. We're running out of graves. You remember in New York, they were running out of places to bury people. It's like we had never seen anything like that before. This was our Spanish flu, right? But we were not equipped for it. We were just not equipped for it. So a lot of people, I don't know what the language limitations are on this, but like lost their shit. You can beat me if you need to. A lot of people just lost it. A lot of people just lost it, and I saw an awful lot of people like fall off into the QAnon ledge, pushed by the fear and uncertainty of what was going on with that, and the fact that we had a person in the White House that you'd wake up every morning and you had no idea what was going to be happening, but it was never going to be good.
Chaos.
It was absolute chaos.
I kind of felt, just from my own perspective, that there was in the 2010s there was this lead up of just people were over authority, and there was like this level above of politicians and corporations were so far above everyone else that they didn't care. It was all bullshit that was coming out of their mouths. So people started just losing trust in authority, all authorities, religious, science.
Can you blame them?
That's what I've said to people about, like I'm very against Trump. No, that's no secret. But I can say I can understand why people voted for him, because they just wanted a change. It was just the same thing of just bland politicians just doing the same stuff over and over again. So people are looking for a change. I don't understand how logically people could support him in the end, but I can see why they have that movement to vote for him. And then you hit the pandemic, and then all of a sudden, again, there's just this, uncertainty, there's chaos, there's fear, all these things. And if you look at the way people get pulled into cults, there's a lot of those same things that enable that. So
this was a grander scale of like a bunch of people got the right things arose at the right time, and then I think that the original person, whoever it was that was posting on 4chan, that was posting the original Q drops, I think was just having fun or doing a LARP, and then that got picked up really quickly, and people, bad actors like recognize like, oh, this is something that really attracts people. Let's jump on this. And so you had Ron Watkins and all these different people that were like manipulating that and jumping on it because they saw it was like something that could be manipulated.
Yeah,
but if you got people that like are going for a thing, good example. So early, right after I did Ong's Hat, I was involved with a couple of people that wanted to do this thing, and it ended up being, let's pretend that we're a time traveler, right? And coming from the future. And like, I wrote up some stuff and we did some things and like, we had some fun with it. And around 2000 and no later than 2003, I think earlier than that, like, we stopped doing it. We were like, that was fun. Like a bunch of people were talking about it. It was John Teeter. And I was like, well, that was fun. Yeah, it was cool. And we stopped doing it, and somebody else picked it up and kept doing it. And then I started seeing the people writing books and people talking about like, John said in 2013 this thing was going to happen. I'm like, oh my God, now it's prophecy. No. And it's like, this was supposed to be a joke. It's like this was an art project. And but then people were taking it seriously. And somebody, I don't know who, but somebody jumped on to that and started using it, So I think that's what happened with Q, was like, somebody started it probably as a laugh or a LARP because it was 4chan. What do you expect? And then people saw that it was something that was compelling to a lot of people and attracted a lot of people, and they jumped on and they used it as quick as they could. They manipulated it and they hijacked it.
I think that in the social media / influencer era, that's kind of it. There's so many opportunities for people. So you see, like with COVID. The funny thing is people say, big pharma's making all the money here, but you see all the anti-COVID people are like the top 5 writers on Substack for a while, earning over $10,000 a month. There's the opportunity there for bad actors as well because of social media and all those things.
Yeah.
Similar to UFO Twitter. There's, you just have deceivers, and especially QAnon, just people cashing in for either power or money. So in terms of QAnon, just looping back to what I was talking about before, as an ARG designer, and talking about how we might protect ourselves, how do you see like things like QAnon or UFO Twitter hooking people in using ARG type strategies?
Well, and I won't deny that they do use some of the strategies. I don't know how to answer that, because like when people I know that should have known better were calling me and telling me all these things about the, they didn't say, they weren't quoting Q, but they were. They just didn't say it. I could not convince them. Like, I was trying to convince them, like, can't you see that this is a game? This is somebody's playing a game with you, or as they would say in the UK, somebody's taking the piss, and they just couldn't see it. They just wouldn't see it. When I was talking about, like, they were saying, but Trump is going to blah blah blah. I'm like, well, wait a minute. Like, Donald Trump doesn't have your interest at heart. There's no evidence that he ever would have. Like, why do you think? Tell me how you got to this place where you think that he's got your best interest at heart, because he's never proven to be anything but a toxic narcissist. Like, his whole life, he's never done anything for anybody but himself. And oh no, he's not a politician. Like, okay, I couldn't get through to them. Like, they didn't want to hear what I had to say. So when I was trying to show them that logically that Q was a construct and that it was a game designed to suck them in and run them in circles, basically, and then just keep picking their pockets while they're running in circles by selling them T-shirts and, like, who knows what. I know there was a lot of stuff sold. I don't know what, but I know there was stuff sold. This is just a game, that's first of all being used to hype up Trump and his people, his whatever you would call that, and also it's while that's happening, they're picking your pockets. But how do I make you see that if you don't want to see it? Like, you can't, you can't convince a person that doesn't want to be convinced. So I just had to give up. I lost a lot of friends. I did.
The whole belief thing is like makes it so difficult. I've pointed out to people, just it's inherently logical. Just as at the very base, QAnon is illogical. That a guy who says he can't share the secrets because it's too dangerous has then gone on 4chan and cryptically shared the secrets for people to solve, and they'll still know the secrets. Like, what is the point? The only point of, like, you might as well just say the secrets. Why make it cryptic?
But we see this formula again and again and again, don't we? Like you said, UFO Twitter. A good example is Bob Lazar. Okay, why would anybody believe that person? I mean, he tells a good story. Don't get me wrong. I love people that tell a good story. I love to listen to the stories that he tells. I think they're great stories. But he's also friends with John Lear. And if you put those two together, you're like, oh, yeah, never mind. It's like, I don't need to hear anything because he's best friends with this guy, and they're feeding each other stories all the time. Like, if you ever see those two together, like, they came up with this whole thing together. Like, this was them together doing this. Like, Bob Lazar and John Lear, this was their game. This was their show. And there's no reason to, like, I can't understand why people don't see that. It's so transparent, but they don't.
Just the desire to believe in a certain story, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look at, like, David Icke. Look at, like, Kathy O'Brien and Mark Phillips. Like, that was all the rage in the 90s. Like, people were just buying this stuff up, like, wholesale. And if you just step back and look at it, you're like, oh, this doesn't make sense, and this doesn't make sense, and this doesn't make sense. And besides, the whole thing just sets off my BS detector. It's like, like, people it seems like they have no intuition anymore. Like, people can't, like, they've lost the ability to, like, to even do rational, analysis on something. But just, like, what about empathy? Or like, do you not have any kind of right brain intuitive sense that this is not right? There's something wrong here. And, like, I don't dismiss intuition at all. I think it's very valuable. And I think we've lost a lot of our instinct and intuition as human beings.
Yeah, definitely. It's that whole, I think I'm just trying to. I keep coming back to this myself, just in terms of how do we move forward as a culture with all this bullshit around.
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, it comes down to just trying to be logical. Say the Bob Lazar thing. Once you find that he has lied or there's untruths 3 or 4 times,
Mm-hmm.
for me, if I meet a person in the street and I see that they've lied 3 times,
Mm-hmm.
I just disregard them as a honest source. Basically, I
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
keep
yeah,
going.
yeah.
Oh, maybe there's something to it. I basically, just for my own good, I just disregard what they say is
Yeah, yeah,
probably bullshit. I think
yeah,
everyone needs to do that a bit more. As soon as you detect that there are, especially if there's willful lies, if there's
yeah,
willful lies, then you should be going, okay, I really need to. My BS detector is on overload. And
yeah,
the other thing is going back to Robert Anton Wilson. I think is just take things a lot less seriously.
yeah,
Too many people just get invested to the point of, with QAnon. I was on forums where people were just almost foaming at the mouth,
yeah,
wanting Hillary Clinton publicly hung, not just like
yeah,
put
yeah,
in
yeah,
jail or
yeah,
something like
yeah,
that. People got
yeah,
to a stage where they wanted to see public executions.
yeah.
And so I think if everyone just chilled a bit and just
All
took
based
things a
on
little
just
bit,
all based on a bunch of nonsense. Like, I mean, far be it from me to say we shouldn't hang politicians, but 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 all this hysteria that was getting whipped up is based. If you go back and look at what's getting whipped up on, like the whole Comet Ping Pong Pizza thing, right? I mean, Podesta is a guy who worked for Hillary Clinton, has an interest in UFOs, has an interest in avant-garde art, obviously, and that's really what they were nailing him on, like because he was talking about those things in his email. Now we have to assume that there's something cryptographically going on with the language of that, because why? I don't know. We have to assume that, and then from there you just like you start snowballing off of that one fallacy. You snowball down the hill and you've got the giant pile of fallacies. You got Pizzagate, right?
yeah.
You've got people walking into a pizza shop with a rifle.
Hmm.
You've got crazy things. I mean, back in the day, I had people showing up at my house. They were like whipped up by people online. They were like spreading weird rumors about like that I work for the government and all this crazy stuff, like which is not true, never been true. I find it insulting to be accused of that because I'm such an anti-government person. But it's like it's very easy to whip people up, and so I started to like really look at like there's 2 levels of the internet. There's like all these like the majority of people are just there consuming this stuff and reacting to it because that's what the internet, especially social media, has been constructed for reaction, right?
Yeah.
And then there's people that like the thin margin of people at the top that are manipulating that for some sort of gain, and it's usually like they want to sell you a video or a book or a T-shirt. It's usually that simple. And sometimes it's even stupider than that. They just want the likes and the hits.
Yeah.
Like it's not
Yeah.
even monetary. It's just like
Yeah.
they just want the love, I guess, or whatever you would call it, the attention. So people do crazy things for crazy reasons. And so that's why I kind of like almost had a breakdown in 2008. It's kind of it all overwhelmed me. And I said, I've got to get out of here. I just got to like go reset myself as a human being and think about how I want to do this. And so what I came away with was spend less time on the internet. I tell all my friends to spend less time on the internet. Teach young people to spend less time on the internet and with less time with technology because I'm older now, so I want to be a responsible elder. Think of strategies to maintain our storytelling and not have it hijacked, right? That's what we've been talking about this whole time is like storytelling getting hijacked. Like how do we build stories that are not hijackable? I made that word up, but how do we build stories that are bulletproof? Like, and one of the ways to do it is build stories for your people, not for sale, not for like marketing capability. How many people can we get this in front of? How can we focus group this and water it down over here to make it more accessible to these people over here? No. Figure out who you're talking to and talk to those people and talk to only those people. And that's it. And don't worry about the fact that your book's not going to sell 1 million copies. I mean,
Yeah.
I just wrote a trilogy and I took some somebody told me something years ago before he passed away. Christopher Hyatt, Alan Miller, who used to run Falcon Press when he was still alive, and he told me, at some point in your life, you need to go write the story that only 64 people in the world are going to want to read. And I took that to heart, and I did it. I wrote a trilogy of a story that it's more than 64 people, thankfully, but it's like definitely not more than 5,000 people on each title. Like I think 15,000 people listened to the audiobook because it was free, but that was free. Like each title has been about 5,000 people have bought it. And I've had a lot of interaction with those people. Most of them have joined the Substack, or they talk to me directly. And I feel like I've found a tribe of people that I can tell stories with.
Yeah.
And I feel like I'm connected to those people,
Yeah. In terms of keeping it self-contained, like you said, like a smaller community, that was something else I was thinking of in terms of strategies. I think in terms of ARG tactics, or not so much tactics, but just the way ARGs work, with the information overload of the internet these days, and pattern recognition, you can kind of go down anywhere. Like if I say to someone, John Podesta and some cryptic other word, if people Google that, they're going to find all sorts of interesting things that will lead them to somewhere else. I wrote a book about Dan Brown's next book that was coming out because he left clues a bit on the cover of of Da Vinci Code as to the next book. And so I was trying to figure out, based on those clues, what was going to be in the next book. And I was surprised by how many, like it would just branch off into all these fascinating, I'd find that this particular individual had lived at this monastery in Italy at the same time as this fascist dictator had done this. And, like there was all these crossovers that seemed really meaningful that actually weren't. So I think with the information overload of both social media and Google, what that allows, you can actually just confirm whatever belief you have. If someone prompts you with maybe this is true, then you can actually end up believing that very easily.
What I've been having more fun doing is with the trilogy, I took all the things I learned about ARGs, and I didn't do an ARG, but I used some of the methodology. And some of the methodology is including things that will cause people to go look for things, right? And when they do, they run across other things. They run across the connections. And what I've gotten back from a lot of people is that this has put them in an environment that is welcome synchronicity for them. And so some people have said, well, I read that thing you said, and I went and looked it up, and I found out that my dad lived in, like everybody had a personal connection at some point to it, right? And so all you have to do is put somebody on a quest, and then they will find the meaning that's personal to them, because a synchronicity is only important if it's important to you. It's a highly personal thing, right? It's like synchronicity my synchronicity may mean absolutely nothing to you, but your synchronicity may mean nothing to me. And so synchronicity is a very, very, very personal spiritual thing. And so you can't create a synchronicity, but you can put people on the quest and put them in the state of mind where they will find synchronicities, or the synchronicity will find them, I should say. And that's something that I've learned to do pretty well, and I'm interested in learning to do more. And the great thing is that besides the fact that people that are reading the works are having synchronicities, I'm having synchronicities as I'm writing the works. And then people are contacting me with their synchronicities, which are giving me more synchronicities. So it's like this living thing. It's a great living thing.
Yeah, I find I spoke to you the other day just about synchronicities and how they tend to almost start colliding with each other. Someone mentions it. It infects. And I really like Jacques Vallée sort of talked about synchronicities once, where he said, we think of space and time just as, just this physical space. And so synchronicities don't make sense. But if you think of like the cosmos as like an information system, like a computer, or I sort of extended it to like the advertising system on a social media site or whatever. If you have one term, it then triggers another term that is not connected physically, but it's just like, you make this. And so it's just an interesting theory, a totally different way of looking at the world, that maybe the cosmos is more information based than sort of just this physical material space.
Absolutely. Because if you've ever studied relational databases,
exactly what he talks about. Yeah,
exactly. That's what the internet, the universe is, a big relational database, because there's connections that are, like I said, there's connections that are personal that only work for me because, for example, I read something in a book about a coffee house. Let's say I'm reading a book and it mentions, going to the French market in New Orleans, because I go to New Orleans once a year, and go to the French market and you get a French market coffee and a beignet. And I go there and I do that. And while I'm doing that, something happens. And it's all because I read about this in a book. And what happens is I have a memory that's triggered by the smell of something that's being cooked in the French market. Now, how can I put that in a database? I can't, right? It's like, but experientially, it's happened. And it's very important to me. And it's like really left an emotional impact on me because of that thing. Because I was put in a position that then something happened that triggered a memory, that triggered an emotion, that then imprinted that on me very strongly. So
yeah, and then I get excited about that sort of thing, and then I come back to, again, if I think about a conspiracy person that's gone too far down the conspiracy hole, they would say the same thing, that they had all these things that meant something to them, and so they're, again, how do we guard against that once we start getting emotionally involved?
Well, I mean, maybe logic helps. If you steeped in maybe logic, and if nobody knows what we're talking about, they could read some of the works of Robert Anton Wilson. So if you got your good Discordian cap on at all times, which I always do, some of this stuff doesn't make sense. Like the whole thing about falling down this belief hole just never made sense to me because, I'm somebody that comes from a background of Discordianism, subgenius, like all these things, which is like, pretend to believe but don't really believe, and have fun in pretending to believe, or at least don't hold on to the beliefs because they're gone tomorrow. I think if we could teach that better, then that would be definitely something that would help. But unfortunately, that's not taught. And I'm as I wandered out into the wilderness when I got older, I discovered that it's definitely not. It's the exception and not the rule to be thinking like that. And what's weird is I came out of this. Peter Wilson once said to me like that I lived on a reservation, but it's okay. It's like you're on a reservation. It's a good reservation though. It's okay. It's like because I did, like, I had a very tight crew. Like I hung around a lot of people that were that thought the way I thought, and at least were open-minded enough to let me think my way, and I was open-minded enough to let them think their way, and we didn't have to be adversarial about it. And then when I got into the real world, when I got a little older, I discovered that that's not the way it usually works. So yeah, that's something that we would benefit from teaching, but how do we do that? So I have to like step back and say, how can I do it? What do I have control over? Is I have control over who I can talk to, and now that I'm older, who I can be a mentor to, and what am I going to teach them? And that's what I can worry about, is like, where can I have the most effect immediately?
Yeah.
I can't change the world. I can't change the educational system. I can't go re-educate the people. I wouldn't want to, but I can't go re-educate the people that didn't get that education. It's like I have to just step back and realize that I don't have to live as a global mind all the time. I have to be more local. I have to think about my community, like who my people are and what can I do to help those people.
Yeah. Just mention of Robert Anton Wilson there also made me think of, in the 60s with Discordianism and Robert Anton Wilson, we had the whole Operation Mindfuck. And for so long, that was like a very cool thing, in the 90s, thinking back to it. And it was ongoing for a while, but, the 60s, 70s, that whole period was the big time. But, entering the 2000s and social media, it's like Operation Mindfuck has almost been turned, again, weaponized. From people like Steve Bannon flooding the zone with shit, through to Vladimir Surkov, Putin's man, who just tries to make misinfo so
sexy,
ever present that nobody knows what's true anymore. So is it time to move on from like the Operation Mindfuck and have some
Yeah.
sort of other approach.
Yeah. I mean, if you would have asked me in the '90s if I thought that there was that Operation Mindfuck could be weaponized, I would have been no way, man. Because I was a Discordian, I was a subgenius, I was a culture jammer, I was all those things, and I didn't think that I was doing bad things, and I wasn't doing bad things, except that what happened was as this became more broad and more people came into the conversation, some of them not not sincere actors at all, and then when the conversation gets large enough, then you get organizations that start paying attention to the conversations, and then it really gets weird because then they want to manipulate that conversation to their benefit. Then the military gets involved. I mean, I tell this story to people, and some people think I'm kidding or that I'm not serious, but this really did happen to me. I got a call from somebody who claimed to be from the Department of the Navy, Naval Intelligence, that said, we're interested in that thing you're doing, which was Ong's Hat. And we want to talk to you about like doing this stuff. And I'm just like, I don't even want to talk to you guys. Like, if this is really who you say you are, I don't want to talk to you. And they're like, well, you can see from the caller ID. I'm like, I can fake a caller ID, dude. I'm a hacker. It's like, that means nothing to me. It's like, if you are who you say you are, just know I don't want to talk to you and never call me again. And I never got a call again. But then in probably around 2004, my now late friend Dave Sobolski was contacted by the Department of Defense, and they said, will you consult with us on creating ARGs? And he asked me, I'm like, no, I don't want anything to do with it. And I don't think it was, I looked at the plan. It wasn't anything nefarious or evil. It's just like, I don't want to be responsible for handing these people the keys to how to do this, for one thing. And I also don't want to get them on my shoe because I don't like the Department of Defense, right? I don't want anywhere near me. And so what he did was he built this construct for them, basically, which was to put people in situations of making moral decisions. And then the Department of Defense could do an assessment of that person, like what would they do in these wartime situations, and can we trust them, and are the things we need to train them on, and but they did start using ARGs that early. And
well,
right after that,
you think of Afosi and Richard Doty, like even in the early 80s.
Oh yeah.
Majestic 12.
Yeah,
those
Dulce.
things were even early 80s. So
yeah.
I think they were already using them in UFO culture to some degree.
Yeah, nobody had named it ARG yet, but yeah, you're right. That's exactly what. Well, I think what Doty said, and I don't think he's lying about this. What he said was that they would put out a rumor, and then they would track the rumor and see who it went from. Like they would see this person told this person, and so like they would tell different rumors to different people, so they could kind of track it and see like what the connections were. Because they were really concerned at the time that the message of the Space Brothers sounded suspiciously like communism. It's like, we should all be equal and share, it's like, and of course the military is going to be like, oh, that sounds very suspicious, It's like, oh, okay, sure. But that's what they were doing, is they were tracking. They wanted to know what was going on with the whole contactee culture.
I'm also reminded, just talking about like maybe precursors to Ong's Hat and ARG type stuff, is Prior of Sion. Are you familiar with that? Like, that goes back even further in terms of documents being planted in libraries, etc. And that. Do you have like in terms of creating Ong's Hat, did you have like a history of other things that inspired you, or
absolutely, yeah? And the Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing was a huge inspiration, because I didn't believe it, but I thought it was very entertaining. I mean, I loved that book when it came out, and I was a little disappointed when Dan Brown came out with this thing. I'm like, oh, I know where you got that from. It's like, come on, man. It's like, because Bob Wilson and I used to sit and talk about the whole Holy Blood, Holy Grail thing like a lot, because about early '90s, because he didn't drive, he didn't have a license, but him and Arlen owned a car, which is weird. And they just moved to Santa Cruz from L.A. to be near their kids. And he had a lot of Bay Area appearances, and so I would drive him. So we spent endless hours in the car together, and we talked about all kinds of stuff. And one of the things I'd love to talk about was the whole, priority design and what's real and what's not real, and what really was happening around Le Chateau, like all these things, and to me it was like, the term wasn't there yet, but I called it a living book, and that's where I kind of came up with the terminology for what I called Ong's Hat. It was like, I want to do a living book like that, because that thing was endless. You could just keep following the threads out of that thing, which I did for years. I just kept following the threads. I'm like, this is amazing, like where this all leads. And some of it, like, unfortunately, went back to bad actors. And some of it, like, went back to people that were probably anti-Semitic, and just weird things like that. But like, that's Europe. That's what you're going to run across. But I thought that was amazing that they tied that, or a group of people over the years had built a legend.
Yeah.
That then Lincoln, Bajan, and Lay wrote a book about a legend that already existed. Like, they didn't make that up.
Such a long game that they played in terms of just placing documents and all that kind of thing.
Yeah. And and then I read Umberto Eco's Foucault's Pendulum. And I'm like, okay, I know what I'm doing next. And that's when it started.
In terms of like the Prior of Silent, that whole mythos, and also the way Dan Brown used it, they both, I think, really used like a treasure hunt aspect that pulls people in and gets used these days, even with the QAnon. It's that treasure hunt aspect of following clues and trying to find that payoff sort of thing.
Well, that's what ARG was kind of like centrally about in the early days. Like all the early ARGs were some sort of treasure hunt. There was always a zero-sum game attached to it, where like somebody had to find the treasure and be the winner. Whereas with Ong's Hat, I was experimenting with the idea of an infinite game, which is a game that was played for the joy of playing, with no real goal of no winning, but just the joy of playing. And how long could we keep that going? Unfortunately, what I discovered in that instance was so many people have been trained to play zero-sum games only and don't even have a concept of an infinite game, that they'll turn an infinite game into a zero-sum game if they have to, because they just don't know how to play an infinite game. So that's what I learned from that. But there's fun things that can be done with the treasure hunt games. Like, Dave and I did some things in the early days. They were fun. I got to do. I'm also very big on acting, because I grew up in Chicago, where there's a lot of improv theater. So improv acting for me is a thing that I like to do. I definitely like method acting very much, and so some of the things we did in the early 2000s allowed me to practice method acting. I got to play characters in the story that people actually met. So like, if you ran across a series of clues, there was like in not Chasing the Wish, but Catching the Wish, there was a series of clues that you would discover a restaurant in Los Angeles at a certain date and time. That's all you knew. And a bunch of people showed up, and there I was. And they're like, "Oh my God, we know who you are." I'm like, "Yeah, so," and I was in character, and I played like this sweating profusely, panicked dude looking over his shoulder like they're going to get me at any time. And the owner of the restaurant was somebody I knew, and I worked out with him that I could go to the bathroom and disappear, which I did. And then everybody was just sitting there waiting for me to come back, and I never showed up again, and I was nowhere to be found in the restaurant because I actually exited through the kitchen. And so they went back on the forums, and they were like, he was sweating and just out of his mind, and like, but he gave us all a signed copy of Ong's Hat. And so we had a lot of fun with that kind of stuff. Is fun, right? It's not the art form as I like to know it, but it's an isolated version of having fun with that. So that you can have fun with that, but like from a bigger perspective, is that the kind of thing I want to promote all the time? No, not really. It's like I'm not really a gamer. That's the thing. I didn't play D&D ever. I've done some, like Bob Wilson and I did a thing at Esalen where I actually did an ARG at Esalen for a weekend seminar that he did, where everybody that had come to see his seminar, I inducted them into a game, and they played the game for the whole weekend. And that was really cool. So that was kind of my first crack at this. This was like 90, want to say 91. It's like, and it's like I'd come up with the idea and then I worked it out and did it there. And then after that, I walked away. It's like, I need to do this on the internet, because that was brand new. The internet was brand new. It was still bulletin board systems. Basically, you could telnet off of the bulletin board system. And I had the belief that it was going to become the predominant form of communication, that we'd be doing what we're doing right now in the future, but a lot of people didn't. So people that were involved in the early days of Ong's Hat, which when it was mail art, I tried to bring on board to do the online version of it, and they just, didn't see it. Well, Peter Wilson, notorious anti-technologist, a Luddite, I showed him the bulletin board systems. I told him what I wanted to do. He said, "You have my blessing, but I want nothing to do with it because I don't even understand what you're saying." And I said, "Well, it's this thing called the internet." He goes, "Can it make me a sandwich?" And I'm like, "No." He goes, "Call me when it can make me a sandwich." That's literally what he said.
In terms of just thinking about your mention about acting within the story, how do we tread that fine line in, playing a game like that? Or I'm thinking too.
Well, I don't anymore, and I wouldn't do it again.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of crop circles as well. That whole deceiving people, creating something, and it gives them this mystical, supernatural experience of they can go into the field, they can feel.
Yeah.
But then you're also deceiving them. So, how do you?
This is how I think about it. So, magic is theater. Do you do ritual magic at all, or have you?
I've dabbled.
Okay, ritual magic is theater. It's a form of theater that puts you in a state of mind to allow things to come through, and whether those things are coming through on the collective unconscious level or they're coming through from an exterior level, that's up to you to decide. I think it's both, but I do recognize that it's theater that gets you in a state of mind that opens you up to being receptive to some sort of communication with some sort of, intelligence, however you want to define that intelligence. So what you just described, there is an element of shamanism to it. Like, you do have to be almost fooled in a way to have a really great, shamanistic initiation, for sure. You have to believe what's happening is really happening. You have to buy it in your head. And one of the things that like when I was in the Golden Dawn, which I'm not anymore, but when I was in the Golden Dawn, there was the initiation, and we were kind of like pseudo-Masonic. And so there was the whole thing where your hands were bound and a dagger was placed to your neck, and you were told, like, if you tell these secrets, you're going to, die, you hang from a bridge, blah, blah, blah. And you had to believe that was real, or it didn't have any meaning. You were just going through empty motions. Like, so you really, as the initiator, you had to sell it. And as the person being initiated, you had to buy it. Right. And so there's this collective bargain that happens, like, so there's consent.
Yeah.
But if you just go out in the world and you start trying to initiate people without their knowledge and without their consent, that's not something you should be doing. You're breaking the rules. I think Leary used to say, "Thou shalt not alter thy neighbor's consciousness without their consent," or something like that. I absolutely believe in that. So in the early days when I was doing theater, and I considered Ong's Hat theater, I thought pretty sure that everybody knew that that's what it was. And a lot of people did, but some people didn't. And then when I tried to tell them without breaking the spell in public, I would bring them to, take them aside privately. Like, you do understand that this is a game and a theater piece, right? And then they would get, they would get insulted, be like, "Of course I do. I'm not stupid." And I'm like, okay, well, cool. Then, good. But then I would hear from somebody they talked to, like, "Well, he told me it was all theater, but I know that's part of the game. It's really real." And, it's like, I'm like, oh, okay. So, I that's why I abandoned the project. I'm like, there's no way around this. I can't manage this. The scale is too big. I can't manage it. So that's why I stopped doing it, because I started to ask myself the same questions. Like, how do I do this without violating somebody's consciousness without their consent? Well, as it turns out, some people you can't. And so I can tell them to go away, which I tried to do, and that seems to make them even more intent on getting in. So that didn't work. I tried to take them to the side and have a one-on-one like human conversation with them, and that didn't work. So I said, well, I just can't do this anymore. I just have to stop doing this, what I'm doing. And then I went back and reassessed the whole thing. Now with ARGs, people knew what they were getting into, and they got into it because they liked the chase and the puzzle and the whole treasure hunt thing, right? So that's okay because they know what they're getting into. And there is something called TNAG. This is not a game, which is a principle of you don't talk about the game. It's like Fight Club. You don't talk about Fight Club, right? You don't talk about the TNAG. You don't say that this is not a game while you're in the game. You're in character. So it's very much like a theater piece. Everybody gets to be a character in the piece, which I like. It goes very well with my whole idea about breaching the proscenium, right? Which is theater that comes off the stage, because I'm really into that. And I've done a lot of street theater, and I've participated in a lot of theater that breaches the proscenium. And to me, that's the most compelling theater, because there's a moment where you start questioning, like, where am I here? Am I on stage or am I off stage? You know, there's a guy in LA, I wish I could remember his name, but he did a theater piece that really got me. It was awesome. I showed up and I went into the auditorium, and the auditorium was two bleacher seats, rows of bleacher seats that were facing each other. And then there was an empty space down the middle. I'm like, oh, okay, it's like this new stage thing they're going to do, right? And we all sat there, and nothing happened. And then, you know, of course, like when that happens, like people start making weird comments and laughing, and that started to evolve. And out of that conversation, you started to recognize that there were actors in the audience, and they started to act out the whole thing in the conversation so that you were part of it. I've never seen, I mean, that was done so seamlessly. I was just like, oh my God, they got all of us. Like, and even when it was over, I wasn't sure who was an actor and who wasn't, because as we all walked out to the front of the theater to get our taxis, the actors went with us and got in taxis, like, and just acted like they were going home from the theater. Right. It was just amazing. It's like beautiful, seamless. That's the kind of stuff I like to do. But you have to be careful when you're doing that kind of stuff online, especially because you can't really, you have to qualify to everybody that this is a piece.
Yeah.
That's what I do. That's why I'm doing what I told you I do now, like, because I build it into a book, but I make sure everybody understands that the book that they're buying is fiction.
Yeah. So the key is basically consent going in. And then you can immerse yourself.
They suspend their disbelief, and then you do what you got to do.
You can become part of it. There can be co-creation. There can be all those sorts of things. It's just as long as, I guess, people don't then start believing in the middle of it.
You can't assume they know. You have to. Unfortunately, I think it really sucks, but you have to qualify it. You know, by saying this is fiction. It's like it has to be found in the fiction section. Is one way to put it. Like,
it's interesting that
liminal, and that ruins it for me in a lot of ways, because it's like very cool to me. Like when I pick something up and think that it's not fiction, and then I find out it's fiction, I really get turned on by that. I'm like, that was cool, you know?
It's unfortunately the way.
But not everybody can handle the fluidity of that. Like I've talked to a couple people who've had incidents in reading my things, and like they're like, you know, they came to me and they're like, I'm having difficulty here because I don't know what's real and what's not real. And I'm like, there's a lot of things in there that really happened to me. There's a lot of things in there that are based on real people and real events and real places, but this story is not real.
Yeah.
Other than it's real on a level of magic. It has magical realism.
Yeah.
So if it's real for you, that's great. But if it's making you paranoid, put it down and walk away from it and don't come back.
Chapel Perilous. Magical things can happen, but also you can go the wrong way as well.
I've used that term more times in the last couple of months for people like, do you understand the concept of Chapel Perilous? No, then I'm going to give you a book you need to read. But if you do, then this is Chapel Perilous. So you just hang on, because it's all good. You're going to come out of this better, you know?
Yeah. It's interesting that liminal space of, I'm thinking about in QAnon, that there are real world effects that they will totally buy into, like January 6th, you know, doing those sorts of things, and possibly worse things could have happened. But at the same time, most of them know it's an
Well,
alternate
somebody did
reality.
die, you know.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
but I think a lot worse could still happen,
Oh, yeah.
and might still happen in terms
I
of
mean,
full
cops
on.
got beat up, and people went away with PTSD from that, and somebody died. So, but yeah, it could have been much worse.
Yeah, but in terms of that, they still know. Most of them still know that it's an alternative reality game, because if what they say is true, if you know a location where kids are getting tortured, you would go straight there, or alert authorities, or do that sort of. You wouldn't talk about it on the internet and say,
Nope.
this person's that. Or in some ways, I kind of respect the guy who did the Comet Pizza shooting, because he actually heard something that he thought was horrible, believed it,
tried to
and
do
went and
something
acted.
about it.
He went and acted on it.
Yeah.
No matter how deluded he was, he actually had the conviction of following up on it. Whereas all these people have this, they live in this liminal space where they must know it's an alternative reality game in many ways because they don't act on it. But then they'll still happily see other people do terrible things or get involved in that crowd of January 6th. And so, like I said, I think it's really necessary for people to keep in mind when they're in a game that you need to not treat it overly seriously to a certain point. You use it to your advantage, but as soon as it becomes negative, you need to just pull the pin on it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's why I said that one of the things that I was naive about in the early days, like in the early 90s when I was doing Ong's Hat, was I assumed that everybody knew that this was a bit, right? This was theater. And a lot of people did. Like the majority of people did, but it's that minority that really makes it uncomfortable for everybody else. And so they wanted it to be real for whatever reason. And every one of those people that I managed to have some kind of conversation with, was in having a personal crisis of some sort at that time, or like had always had a problem, like delineating between reality and fantasy, or like you never know who you're dealing with on the other end of the line on the internet. This is that old story, like you could be a dog on the internet and nobody would know it. It's true. But in the early days of the internet, we just that none of that stuff. We didn't know any of that stuff yet. But like I started the Ong's Hat game in '99, officially online. I pulled the plug in 2001, right before 9/11, because it just became not fun for me, and really not fun for the people who were there to have fun. The people were leaving the forum because they're like, I can't stand these crazy people that have shown up. And some of that
UFO Twitter.
Exactly. Like, I had seen the ugliness of the UFO community online on Usenet back in the day, and even on the bulletin board systems. And even before that, like if you go back and look at Saucer Smear, and like there's always been hate and vitriol in the UFO community or the paranormal community per se, wider, but they're kind of the same. There's a Venn diagram where they cross. Yeah, I mean, we didn't know, but now we know. So now we know we have to practice more responsibility in, like making sure the story is shepherded correctly. That's how I'll put it. So like you have as a storyteller, you have a responsibility.
Yeah, and as receivers, we have a responsibility, I think, to understand how much of this is now out there, and so we need to really guard our own consciousness against it. Immerse yourself in it where it's useful. Like you said, there's things you can really get out of it, but also just guard against someone else using you.
Yeah, read Cosmic Trigger, read Prometheus Rising. Maybe do some of the exercises. Just learn about how much reality is up to you. Who is the master that makes the grass green? And learn those things and practice those things. And it's still shocking to me that in this day and age, the majority of young people that I'm meeting and talking to have not learned those basic principles. But then when I think about it, it's like, well, they're not taught those basic principles ever. Now, who's going to teach them? Because it's not taught in the public school, and it's probably not taught by their parents unless they're really lucky. And now that I've been in the world, outside of the reservation for a while, I understand that, the majority of people out here are not like us. So we just have to realize that, and we have to we have to be responsible for the stories we tell and how they're told, and then we have to be responsible for how we relay those stories, and then we have to be responsible enough to listen to people when they have problems with it's like I'm reading your story and it's triggering all these synchronicities for me and I don't know what that means. Well, great. You're getting synchronicities. That's a good thing. You're getting this sign from the universe that you're part of a living system. That's a good thing. It's a little disconcerting the first time it happens to you. I get it. But just accept that as a good thing and not something to fear. Because the first thing we do is everybody freaks out. We all do it the first time. But if you don't have somebody there, and this is really the thing, we don't have a society that's structured so that we have elders that we can talk to about these things. I can't, my grandparents are gone, but if they were still here, I could not talk to them about this except for my grandfather on my mom's side was definitely a black sheep. He was the owner of a 3-ring circus. He was an occultist. He was a bohemian. So I could talk to him, but he was the only person in my family that I could talk to about any of this stuff. And I was very lucky that I had him because most people don't have somebody like that they can talk to, right? There's no elder that they can go to and say, help me make sense of this. Has this happened to you before? Yeah, it's happened to me before. Let me tell you. There's nobody, right? So
Yeah.
we're a generation or several generations now of potential shamans who are failing our initiations because we don't have proper training and we have nobody to fall back on.
Yeah. There's absent parents even now with, talk about all these young men following Jordan Peterson because they need some sort of fatherly. We needed them to go to Robert Anton Wilson. Instead, they ended up with Jordan Peterson. We really screwed up.
Yeah. I mean, even if your parents are at home, they're usually not present, if you know what I'm saying. Everybody's so preoccupied with keeping up with their Facebook post and,
working 2 jobs and
working 2 jobs and all the things that you have to do. My parents were not checked in with me, and I don't blame them for it. It's that was their generation and they did the best they could. But I wouldn't say we had a great relationship. I don't think they knew me really at all. And I got very lucky that my grandfather saw me and he took me aside and he's like, okay, listen, you're like me. So you're not like them and they're not going to understand you. So come to me with the problems, because he heard me talking about things and saw me reading things. And he's like, yeah, I need to talk to this kid. He's got questions and they can't answer them. But I realize now how lucky I was, because that's not the case usually. Yeah. That's not the case.
Yeah, I grew up, I was pulling out Manly P. Hall books in the library at age 7, but living in a small town, So I guess that's a good point too, that we need mentors, and we should be mentoring where we can.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I'm saying is we need to control the story. And as elders, I don't know how old you are, but like I said, I'm 62 in a couple weeks. I now finally accept the fact that I'm an elder, and that's okay. It's I did the American thing where I had an extended neoteny of my youth, but I grew up, and the thing that we have to take responsibility for is that there are other generations behind us. They may not be blood relations to us, but that's okay. We need to pick up the mantle and be responsible for helping them because they're the future. If there is a future, they're it.
Yeah. I think I came into this conversation looking for a way out of just, I feel a little bit helpless with all the things that are happening, but I think we kind of hit on some good points in terms of, finding responsibility as storytellers, responsibility as recipients, mentoring, read some Robert Anton Wilson.
So tighten your circle up a little bit. Don't because, especially me coming out of Silicon Valley in the early days, I was trained to how many units of this thing can you get to how many people, how fast, right? That was hammered into me. And I was at Adobe for a long time, and I was responsible for distributing the Acrobat Reader in the early days when we first built it. And so I had this whole mindset of how can I get this in front of as many people as I possibly can to make them download it and use it? And then I kind of started applying that to Ong's Hat in the beginning. Like, how can I get this in front of everybody? Because that's how I was trained to think. And then I kind of step back and say, no, that's not it. I tried that. That's not it. So go away somewhere, go to the North Pole, rethink this, really sit down and think this through. Like, what's broken in this scenario? And what's broken in the scenario is scalability. We shouldn't be scaling things as large as we can.
Yeah.
Because that all goes back to this Silicon Valley thinking of endless growth. There is no such thing as endless growth. That comes with a great cost, and eventually it comes at a final cost. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're going through right now on Earth. It's like we thought we could go through this endless cycle of growth, which is stupid when you think about it. Like, we live on a planet of finite resources. I don't care what people say. It's a planet of finite resources.
Yeah.
Like, there's a carrying capacity to this planet, and we're way over it.
Yeah.
Right.
And like you said, that whole scalability thing, as humans, we are only capable of a certain amount of social circle and a certain amount of information. And we're breaching those things all the time, and it's costing us.
Why did I have 10,000 people in my contact list? Like, why? It's like, am I going to talk to those people? Am I really going to connect to those people? So in the endless growth scenario, those are all business contacts, and like, that made sense. But now that I'm like down to like, how many people can I have a meaningful relationship with? Can I really know and have a conversation with? It's not 10,000 people. It's maybe not even 1,000 people. It's more like 100.
Yeah, I think that's
and then,
really
with the book thing, like, you can do a little, you can scale that a little more, because it's like, I can reach more people than I can talk to and get to know, but I can get to know a lot of people through the books. But I can write something that's going to appeal to 5,000 to 15,000 people, right?
Yeah.
And in the independent publishing world, 5,000 to 15,000 is considered a success. Chuck Palahniuk told me this in Portland. He said when they approached him to make Fight Club into a movie, he had only sold 5,000 copies of the book. And somebody in Hollywood, I know who it was, but I won't say. Somebody in Hollywood got their hands on it. It's a name you would know. Got their hands on it, read it, liked it, handed it to the right people in Hollywood, who handed it to the right people, and then it got made, right? But it was only a book that 5,000 people had read. Because if you read that book, it's like, okay, I get this because I used to hang out with the Cacophony Society in San Francisco. I get it, right? But how many people get that?
Yeah.
But then that got scaled up, like, it turned into something else that got misunderstood. Like, people definitely took it to be the opposite of what it was.
Yeah, Tyler Durden becomes a hero to young men.
Yeah, exactly. And he was not supposed to be. Or another example is like the early days when I lived in San Francisco, I used to go to the Beach Burn, which turned into Burning Man. And I stopped going to Burning Man in 1994 is the last time I went, because MTV was there, and I'm like, well, it's over. Like, when they show up, it's over. And look at it now. It's like, it's nothing I would want to go to. Not appealing to me at all. And it's not even the same people.
Yeah.
Like, the people that started it aren't even involved anymore.
Yeah. Speaking of like smaller books, and you mentioned a few times now your recent books, The Liminal Cycle. Do you just want to discuss that quickly before we wrap things up?
Yeah. So I think I told you in 2018, I did this trip north. I went up to Alaska, and I worked 3 months in the fishing industry for the sockeye season in Naknek in Alaska, which is like this place that you can only get to by plane and boat. There's no roads anywhere going in or out of it. And then as I was there, as the season was wrapping up, I was sitting at this cafe. It's a tiny little village, but they have a cafe. And I was sitting at this cafe, and I met these Japanese gentlemen. They were really cool, and we had some beers together, and we started talking. And I said, well, you guys up here to fish, right? No. We're just passing through. I'm like, well, where are you going? We're going to the Arctic Circle. We're part of this scientific, mission that we're going to be measuring methane release for climate change. And I said, wow, that's cool. That'd be cool to go on that. And they're like, well, do you know how to do IT? I'm like, as a matter of fact, I do. And they're like, no. I'm like, yeah, I even know how to do satellites. And they're like, "Oh, you're the guy." So I ended up hiring onto that boat as the communications operator, and I went with them on this thing, and I was like shooting all the data up to it's called squirting the bird, shooting the data up to the satellite. And I saw some things that really changed my life because I saw permafrost that had been melted for over 5 years, that had been permafrost for hundreds of thousands of years, and I saw polar bears on the floes. Like I saw all the stuff that really you don't really understand that climate change is real until you see that, and then you can't deny it. And like this is 2017, so I was like, I can't deny climate change anymore. I can't even like look past it. It's like it's happening. And then I told you like the darkness and the daylight and all the things that happen to you when you spend time in the Arctic Circle. It did something to my head, not a bad thing, but it definitely did weird things to my head. And I came back after that trip, and I was having trouble readjusting and reintegrating into society. And I thought, I know there's this story I'm hearing somebody in my head telling me, and if I write it down, it will go away. And I did, and it did, and it turned out it was the first book of Liminal. And when I wrote that one, I suddenly saw like part 2 and part 3. Like I'm like, oh, this is a trilogy. I have to write this trilogy. And so I wrote that trilogy, and it's all what I consider a received work. Like each time I did it in trance mode, long periods of different things of putting myself into the proper state of mind, and kind of wrote this almost automatic writing. It was weird. Didn't have to do a lot of editing on any of it. And then I published it, and I realized that this is the thing that Christopher Hyatt told me years ago that I should write. This is the book that only 64 people in the world might want to read. And I put it out, and more than 64 people liked it, but a lot of people liked it. So I'm like, okay, cool. This is the thing that I was supposed to do. Is like I need to do these new kind of stories that are coming from another place, and they need to be modern legends, modern stories that speak to people of the current generation, and it's their world and their story, and it's things they can relate to. And it also ties back into a lot of old traditions that I expose them to through this storytelling. And so I'm showing them like this old tradition is not that old. It's still around. It's just, it's changed a little bit. So, using the Vallée model, you can say, there's always been some sort of otherness intelligence that we've had communication with since we can remember, since before we can remember. And there's pictures of them on cave walls, and there's scratchings and writings, and like and then there's stories of the Fae, and there's UFO stories. Like this is all the same thing. It's like some crypto intelligence is trying to have communication with us that we can have communication with. And we can either not be prepared for it and freak out like some people do if they're not prepared, or we can be prepared for it. And as I don't want to call myself a shaman, so I'm just going to say as a modern elder, I want to help young people be prepared for it.
Is that self-published?
It is self-published. I shopped it. So the thing is that the first one, actually, when I was in Hollywood, I knew enough people in the industry that they wanted to look at it, and it started to get shopped around in Hollywood to get made into an independent film. And I played with that for a while, and then I'm not going to say the names, but somebody put it in front of somebody, and that somebody said he wanted to make it as a movie, and then that somebody fell into disrepute and became somebody that I didn't want to be involved with. And so I said, I'm just going to publish this as a book. And so I did the first one as a book. The second one actually is an audio drama where I got actors to actually act out everything, and I wrote it as a book. But there's an audio drama that I put out. You can buy a version of it on Audible. You can find there's a free version on YouTube if you want to listen to it on YouTube for free. There's a Bandcamp version if you want to buy a Bandcamp version, and you get the ebooks with that. So it's different packages, but basically it's an audio drama that I put together. The second part takes place in Big Sur, and it's all the notes of a guy who's recording things on his cell phone. as he's going through this extraordinary experience in the woods with critters and having experiences. And the third one is an interactive PDF that I put out. And I'm going to print it probably early next year as a 4-color graphic novel, because that's what it is. It's a 4-color graphic novel. So the first part is actually written as a movie treatment, but I may make it into a movie in the future, but it's going to be independent. I'm not going to go through Hollywood because I've had bad experiences of dealing with those people. The second one is an audio drama that's also a book, and the third one is a graphic novel.
And if people want to learn more about you or your backstory, you've got a website?
Yeah, josephmatheny.com.
Easy peasy.
So JOSEPHMATHENY.com.
We'll put that in the description of the YouTube video as well. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Me too.
Followed your work for a long time, so it's great to sit down and talk about these things. We've got a lot of common interests, so I'm sure everyone will really enjoy this conversation.
I hope so.
Thanks for coming along and chatting to us, taking time out of your day.
Absolutely. Thank you.